Welcome back. This session, as you know, is going to be in English. We're going to have a conversation about Mr. Trump, who this guy is, where he comes from, what kind of U.S. president is being, and how he sees the world, how he sees Europe, what can we expect of U.S.-European relations during his presidency from now to 2020. But before that, and beyond that, actually, hopefully, well, we're not going to make any political judgment here, and I'm certainly not going to express my political views. But before going into that, let me just introduce myself and my fellow speaker here. My name is Riccardo Alcaro. I'm the coordinator of research and head of the Global Actors Program at the Istituto Affari Internazionali, foreign policy think tank in Rome, you might be familiar with. On my left, you see Jeremy Shapiro, who is Director of Research at the European Council on Foreign Relations, one of the biggest and newest European think tanks. Before that, Jeremy was a senior fellow at Brookings, Washington, D.C.'s leading foreign policy think tank, actually not only foreign policy. It's a very, very big think tank in Washington, D.C. Very influential people work there or have worked there. I had a chance to work at Brookings for a year, and so Jeremy and I have known each other for some years. I'm really happy he accepted our invitation to be here and talk about the matter at hand, because there are a few people in Europe that can talk about Trump in as entertaining a way as Jeremy will do. I also want to thank the organizers, of course, the Modena municipality, the University of Modena, the Renzenbeni Summer School for organizing this event. I really hope you're going to enjoying it. We have thought that in order to inject some, some variation in the program, this session is not going to unfold as a lecture, but rather as an interview. So I'm going to ask Jeremy a few questions about Trump, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you guys. And as I said, this topic is very much about Trump and what lies behind Trump. We will address the topic from three different angles. First, I'm going to ask Jeremy who is Trump as the celebrity businessman? What kind of politician, of American politician he is? How different he is to the mainstream American politician, what his relationships have been with the U.S. political world, and particularly the two main political parties in the United States, the Democratic and Republican Party, of course. Then we will move to Trump, the candidate, to understand why his message was successful, or at least successful. You all know that Trump actually lost the popular vote, but you now know for sure that that's irrelevant for winning the U.S. presidency. You have to win a certain number of electoral colleges, and Trump did it. And so we're going to see why Trump got so many votes. Not more than Hillary Clinton, but certainly enough to win the presidency. So what lies behind Trump's success? Where does Trump the politician come from? And finally, Trump the president, to see, to delve into how he's faring as president, both on the domestic front and on the international front. You're going to see that the international front is to an extent very much determined by, very much shaped by the domestic dimension, how Trump sees the world, how Trump sees Europe, and so this is the overarching structure of our discussion. And yeah, so Jeremy, let's start with Trump the guy, Trump the man, but particularly Trump the businessman celebrity. How has this guy become a celebrity? First, what kind of relationships has he had with the US political establishment, and how different he is with regard to the mainstream US politicians? And what does that mean for I mean, what can we see into this, into him emerging as a leading political figure in terms of how US politics is changing?
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks for that introduction. It's nice to be here. I feel a bit distant from you, but we'll try to make this as intimate as possible. Trump is I guess it's perhaps the most depressing aspect of my analytical life, that I am now called upon wherever I go to understand the man Trump and his voters, because he is, not really worthy of our analysis. It's not a complicated psychological picture. He's not a complicated man. I think the politics that produce him are quite complicated, and we can discuss that. They're at least worthy of discussion, although depressing. So I don't want to go too much into the biography of Donald Trump. I think he was born rich, and he has cultivated. He managed to cultivate in the 1980s, particularly starting in the 1980s, a certain celebrity around being wealthy, which is a sort of uniquely American phenomenon, whereby he was famous for being rich. And he parlayed that into a lot of attention, because he was always incredibly attention-seeking. He parlayed that into a lot of media coverage and ultimately a lot of name recognition, and then eventually a reality television series in which he would fire people on the air. And so the upshot of that is not that Trump is an interesting man. He's a very sort of typical sort of celebrity in this in the sort of purest sense of the word, in that he's famous for being famous, and no one's quite clear on what he'd ever done. But it does highlight a couple of things. First of all, Trump, in distinction from a lot of celebrities, not all, but a lot of celebrities, has always been sort of interested in politics, has always believed that he had better answers than the politicians in Washington, that he had a better mode of thinking, that he understood how to do deals. This is, if you've ever met, really stupid people, they have the advantage of not knowing how stupid they are, and that gives them a certain confidence, right? And so, if you notice, if you meet a smart person, they're aware that that the President of the United States or someone in a similar position has a lot of difficult choices, is wrestling with a lot of difficult things. They may not think he's doing a great job, but the smarter they are, the better they will realize that actually they wouldn't necessarily do a better job in the same position. You should examine your own conscience on this, by the way. Trump has never felt that way, so you can make your own judgments about his intelligence. He has always believed that if he were President of the United States, he could cut through all of these problems, which are essentially seem to him to be quite simple. 6 months into the job, he solved none of those problems, by the way, but he still believes that. But I think the point I would like to make is that he's a celebrity who's long been interested in politics and formed very jejune views on politics. But the celebrity is really quite important. The wealth is important too, but the celebrity is maybe the most important thing, because he, as a celebrity, he didn't really have much of an ideology. He doesn't have much of a political family, but he does have a connection with the American public, which is quite extraordinary, and has been long before he ran for public office. When he announced his candidacy for presidency in July of 2015, 90% of the public already knew who he was. That's quite unusual. Politicians don't usually have that's a name recognition which is up near where the President of the United States is. The President of the United States tends to be around 95 or 96. Always makes me wonder who the 5% who don't know who the President of the United States is, but put that aside. And so there had never been a candidate who ran for the presidency who already had that level of fame and that level of intimate interaction, or someone who wasn't already president, at least, or already in the political field. And it meant that he was able to completely bypass the party system. The party system in the United States, both parties, frankly, are, not to put too fine a point on it, a bit oligarchic. They have long been able, through the primary system principally and a few other mechanisms, to control who the candidates will be that are then presented to the public to run against the other party. So the United States, I think it's fair to say, it's a democracy, but it's also a sort of competitive oligarchy. It's probably something you recognize from Italian politics. And the ways in which they controlled that were by access to media, access to money. And typical candidates, when they started off, they couldn't get anywhere as a presidential candidate unless they had access to media so they could become known, unless they had access to money so that they could get access to media and become known. Trump had both of those things to start off. And so he didn't need the Republican Party or any party to make a connection with the American people. And he was able, I think, to parlay that into the first certainly the first successful, truly independent presidential run in many decades. Certainly in my lifetime, I'm not really sure how far back you'd have to go, but probably to the 19th century, to find a candidate who was able to become president with so few dependencies on existing political structures. And that means that he had no brain trust, he had no staff, he had no ideas, he had no connections to the various political forces, very few connections to the various political forces in the United States. To the extent that he had them, they've all been acquired in the last 2 years. And he had, and I think maybe most importantly, he had no idea how to govern. So that, to me, that is the sort of very weird background. I think, I'm not sure where you want to go with this, Ricardo. We can talk about what impact that will have on American politics moving forward, but if you want to move on to other subjects, we can do that too.
Yeah. I mean, that was the perfect introduction. And so we have now, you have sketched the profile of a candidate who seems to be a third-party candidate because of his personal history, because of the assets he had in terms of money and ability to be recognized, or recognition factor, whatever you want to call it. Still, Trump ran as a candidate for one party, the Republican Party. It is common wisdom now to say that Trump actually effected an hostile takeover of the party. But he definitely had And he definitely has, and these days is proving it, he definitely has a very complicated relationship with established figures within the Republican Party, particularly the House Speaker, Paul Ryan, and the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell. Yet, he does have a connection with the Republican base. He got 46% of the votes, so basically there has been almost no movement between parties. So in terms of who voted Trump, these are the same people who voted for Romney, the same people who voted for McCain. So my question here, looking back at the campaign, both the campaign for the primary campaign to get the nomination to be the Republican nominee for president, and the general election campaign. Let's try to understand where this support for Trump come from, where did it come from, and why was the Republican Party a more fitting environment for Trump than the Democratic Party?
Good questions. So, American political parties are not like European political parties. Actually, they're properly speaking not really parties at all. They're coalitions of parties that the only thing that they sort of share is a dislike for the other party. And so they are a way of dividing the political system into two. Neither of them are coherent ideologies. They represent coherent ideologies. They both are a bundle of semi-inconsistent ideologies, and they are only able to define themselves at all in contrast to each other. And Trump is a very good example of why this is true. Trump is ideologically not attuned. He doesn't have much of an ideology, but to the extent that he has positions, he is not ideologically in sync with either party. That's not so untypical, by the way, but it's particularly pronounced in Trump's case because typically what happens is not that you become ideologically part of a party exactly, but you become, through your experience, through your career, associated with a party, and it's very hard to leave because there's huge cost to that. It becomes your network. And so it's like they used to say about the sort of street gangs in L.A., those are two famous street gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, and they used to say, they really hate each other, but they both sell drugs. And essentially the Republicans and the Democrats both hate each other, but they both sell drugs. And you can't leave the Bloods and join the Crips, even if you're really good at selling drugs, because it's your gang. Trump didn't come up with a gang. He had a choice, uniquely, which one to join. He had tried the Democratic Party, and he didn't get on very well there. I think that there are two principal reasons why he ends up in the Republican Party. The first is just opportunity. In the last 10 years, there hasn't really been much opening in the Democratic Party because it's been so dominated by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. In 2004, essentially, when he looked a little bit at the presidency in 2000, but the Democratic Party was dominated by Gore. He really started looking seriously at the presidency for 2008, and there were he assessed, as far as I understand it, that he couldn't win because Clinton would win. And interestingly, she didn't. But he still assessed that in 2016. But I think the other reason, which became more important over time, is that he is, to be fair to him, I don't really want to be fair, but I'll try. He is a politician. He wasn't very interested in getting in with the gang leaders, but he did understand that he did have to run to win the primary. He had to connect with the base of one of the parties. And Trump, interestingly, has really only 3 issues that, if you look through the campaign, that he really seems to have developed any ideology or any consistency on. They are basically immigration, trade, and terrorism. Immigration he made an assessment sometime before the 2016 campaign started, that immigration was the issue that he could run on, that he could connect with the base of the Republican Party on. He wouldn't have been able to connect with the base of the Democratic Party on that issue. He might have been able to connect with them on trade, but if you look at his positions on those 3 issues, 2 of them, terrorism and immigration, point to the Republican Party. Trade works for both of them. So it made the choice. So both the sort of opportunity and the issues that he wanted to run on made the choice of the Republican Party very clear. Now, honestly, I don't know precisely why he won the Republican primary. I think there were 17 candidates in the Republican primary. And I have to say that if we ran that experiment 10 times, he would probably lose 9 of them. It was a very random event. And we can do a lot of analysis of it, but I'm never going to understand it, and I'm never going to understand why those people voted for him. But the general election is a lot easier to understand. And the general election was a very, very standard election in American politics, actually. And it reflects the fact, something which has very little to do with Trump, which is that the American politics has become extremely polarized. Regardless of the fact that the Bloods and the Crips both sell drugs, people are very, very loyal to either the Bloods or the Crips. And so people are extremely loyal voters, particularly in the presidential campaign, to their party, to the party that they have always voted for. Well over 85%, pushing 90% of the voters had already decided which party they were voting for before the nominees were even known. They were always going to vote for that party. And so what that means, if you think about it, is that the election is decided in the states in which that's close, and with the last 10% of the voters who tend to be the least engaged voters, the least knowledgeable about politics, and that creates an environment in which any candidate, frankly, can win. Any general election candidate can win. And this was an incredibly close election. But it was always going to be a close election, and the next one will be close, because the country is fairly evenly divided between the 2 parties, and whoever is the standard bearer will be sort of spotted 45, 46% of the vote. And it's interesting, if you look at the 2016 election, what you realize, I think this is elided a lot in the political coverage. The story of the general election is not people moving their votes from Democrats to Republicans. That is not the difference between 2016 and 2012. The story of the election is who showed up to vote. People do not, in any large numbers, switch their votes. But people do decide to stay home or go out to vote, depending on how enthusiastic they are. So in essence, what American presidential campaigns have come down to is exciting your base and discouraging the other guy's base and changing the turnout. Somewhat more nefariously, trying to affect turnout through voter registration and voter access. It's not about convincing people. It's not about the political disputes. The primaries, I think, are different, but the general election was very much that way and will be, has been for the last several cycles and will be certainly in the next cycle. And Trump, interestingly, people thought when Trump being such a distinct candidate, Trump being not a Republican in the true sense of the word, Trump having such a distinct ideology or such a lack of ideology relative to a traditional Republican candidate, that might not be the case in the 2016 election. The 2016 election, general election, might look different. And it didn't. And I think one of the things that that demonstrates is that people are voting for their party in the presidential election, for the standard bearer of the party, and maybe more importantly, they are voting against the other party. People were, and there's been a lot of polls that have shown this, people were very, very scared. Trump voters are very scared of the Democratic Party, very scared of Hillary Clinton. That was, when you talk to them, actually, Trump got something approaching 25% of the primary vote, but he got, 90% of the Republicans over 90% of the Republicans in the general election. Those 65% of Republicans who moved to Trump as their second choice, that's obviously a huge portion of the electorate. When you talk to those people about Trump, they don't express enthusiasm for Trump. They express frustration, fear of the Democrats and of Hillary Clinton. And I would imagine that is going to be the pattern of American politics for the next few years. So we'll probably get into this, but Donald Trump will become the Republican nominee, and then the issue will be not, do you want a second term of Donald Trump exactly? It's, do you want a second term of Donald Trump or that Democrat, whoever that Democrat is, and however they've succeeded at demonizing that next candidate.
Jeremy, you have partly touched on this already or hinted at, but I want to make one theme which has been central to Trump's political career and presidency really explicit here. And the theme is nationalism. It has been a sort of article of faith for American politicians to show patriotism. And true patriots, Democrats or Republicans alike, at least since the end of the Second World War, were supposed to favor America's greatness by promoting America's engagement in the world, by promoting America's hegemony in the world, or, I mean, of course, it depends on which angle, it depends on where you stand. But the point is, America's presence in the world was directly related to the idea that America was a great country. So being a patriot meant being in support of America's being a great country, and America's being a great country meant America being a world leader, or at least the leader of the free world. It's an expression the Americans have come out with. I don't think that anyone in Europe or even in Asia, and I'm talking about countries which have been allied to the US for 70 years, really think of the US president or thought of the US president even during the Cold War as the leader of the free world, as their leader. But certainly as a very important, I mean, as the most important international figure. Now we have a different kind of patriotism, which has basically turned the idea of America's engagement, America's internationalism, let's call it that way, even though it's somehow inaccurate, into a sort of treason. True nationalism, true love for America lies somewhere else. And Trump seems to have tapped that somewhere else I'm talking about. So Why don't you elaborate on this? Because that was a very important thing during the election, and it is being a very important thing, shaping his presidency.
Thanks, Ricardo. I'm a little bit disappointed to find out that you don't view America as the leader of the free world, but
The American president.
yeah, well, all right, I'll learn to live with that. But I think you've touched on something really important, and I really like the way that you phrased that question. I haven't heard it phrased in exactly that way before, and I think it makes a lot of sense, because it's very clear, and this is implicit in your question, that America is and has always been a very, very nationalistic country. If you've ever been to an American sporting event, you know what I mean. I was in the U.S. last month, and I noticed that they sing the national anthem twice during baseball games now. Once wasn't enough. They pause do it at the beginning, and then they pause in the middle to do it again, where they acknowledge all of the military in the stadium at every baseball game. So it's an incredibly nationalistic country, and particularly by European standards. But that's not remotely new. And every American president has, of necessity, honored that nationalism. But as you were pointing out, up until Trump, most of them were able to convert that nationalism into an internationalist mission. They were able to define American nationalism as a mission for the world. They were able to say that the way that we keep America safe is by keeping the world stable. And this has been the core of American foreign policy since 1945. And, you know, I would submit somewhat controversially that this has never been very popular with the American public. The oligarchic system worked very effectively here, because actually that idea of an American nationalism which had a global mission was a bipartisan consensus amongst the two oligarchies. Obviously there were foreign policy debates about between the Democrats and the Republicans, but they weren't about that core issue. They were about, whether we should invade Iraq or not about whether America should be the global policeman. Both of the parties shared that. And I can tell you, existing in the sort of foreign policy community within Washington, as I did for many years, it was quite striking the degree of consensus that existed on that. And so that wasn't no American presidential candidate could get through the primaries, could get past the oligarchy without accepting the American global role. So in fact, that question had never been tested really with the American public before. But actually, because of some of my previous work, I had done a lot of thinking about American public opinion on this issue. And it was very clear that from the beginning of the Cold War, the American public had never been very bought into that issue. It's a sort of lost episode in Cold War history, but in the sort of period between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Korean War, so 1945 to 1950, the American government was struggling to create an internationalist position against a lot of domestic opposition. And in fact, the American army, which had built itself up, the American military, which had built itself up to a size of 13 million people by 1945, demobilized spectacularly within 18 months of the end of World War II and basically ceased to exist. It went down to its sort of pre-war nub, a tiny army. The Truman administration was failing to make its case to the Congress and to make its case to the American people that the United States should fight the Cold War. And in fact, Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State under Truman, has a line in his memoirs where he was talking about this incipient failure, and he says, and then the Korean War came along and saved us. And what the Korean War enabled them to do was to create a specter of threat from the Soviet Union, which created the sense that America and American nationalism demanded a global role, demanded the protection of Europe, demanded the protection of East Asia, and that over time solidified itself into certainly the foreign policy consciousness of the consciousness of the foreign policy elite in the United States, but even to a degree in the public. But they were never it was never a mission that they wanted. It was never a mission that they supported outside of the direct security of the United States. And Trump, I don't know whether he saw it in such intellectual terms, I rather doubt it, but he was the first candidate of any stature, of any success, to be able to make the case to the public at large that this is bullshit. We don't want to do this. We don't want to spend our money on defending Japan. We don't want to spend our money on defending Europe. We don't want to send American boys abroad to die in Iraq for reasons we don't really understand. And the public was responded to that, I think. Again, they were divided on the question, but what was intriguing is that Trump went around the entire foreign policy consensus on this. He didn't just oppose the Democrats on this, he opposed the Republicans on this. What I've noticed amongst my cohort in Washington, the people who think about, which is where the sort of gang that I'm from, is the sort of foreign policy scene. There is no difference between Democratic and Republican foreign policy people anymore. Because they've now realized that the fights that they were having in the Obama administration and before about whether we should withdraw from Iraq or not were the narcissism of small differences. And now they are fully united in opposing Trump's agenda and trying to get people into his administration who will oppose the agenda that he ran on. Having some success in that, I think. But they've certainly been made clear to them that the public doesn't support the foreign policy consensus that is in Washington, and that probably the next presidential candidate, Republican or Democrat, isn't going to run on a globalist agenda anymore because it's not very effective. And now that the alternative has been shown, I think it's going to be very difficult to sustain a globalist agenda.
Jeremy, this is my last question before asking the students here to step in and ask their own questions. And my last question is about foreign policy and specifically Europe. You just said that Trump has, in a way, opened up new opportunities for the next would-be presidents in the United States. These people will not have to show the same attachment, the same commitment to global America as it was a standard practice before Trump, up to Obama, definitely. So what can we expect of U.S.-European relations, or better, U.S. commitment to Europe, or U.S. relationship, of the U.S. relationship to Europe? What can we expect of the U.S. as a European power now and in the next future? I mean, the U.S. has been definitely the most important player in Europe for many decades. It certainly was during the Cold War. It is not as important, at least visibly important, as it was before the end of the Soviet Union, but still it matters so much. I mean, during my job, which is studying the foreign policy the foreign policies of European Union member states, you always come across America as the most important external relationship, or a relationship so impactful that shapes preferences, shapes objectives, determines, big balances, because it is, depending on the kind of relationship you have with America, you're going to spend that amount of money on defense, you're going to use the money you don't spend on defense for other purposes. And if you have strong ties with America and an access to the US president, you're going to try to push for the United States to be more internationalist in the European sense, which means more multilateralist. So America is really a constant factor in all calculations of foreign policy people, and not only foreign policy people in Europe. And this has been also a reflection of this huge and rooted presence America has had in the last 70 years here in the old continent. So if this is going to change, if America's commitments to Europe is going to change, how is the relationship going to change? And how is this going to impact on Europe as a strategic theater and on Europe as a strategic player?
I thought the questions would be easier. It's actually a fair question, because I did just write a 10,000-word paper on it. But now when I reflect back on what that paper actually says, I realize that the main answer is I don't know. I think there are two opposing forces going on in the United States, and you can definitely see them in the first 6 months of the Trump administration. As I said, the public is really not interested in a continued U.S. commitment to Europe of any great degree. It's not the highest thing on their list of issues, but it's not something which has a lot of support. And frankly, this is something that you saw in the Obama administration. You saw it even before that, but definitely in the Obama administration. Obama was trying to make the case, because he had felt, the president really is the place where domestic politics and foreign policy comes together. He is the one who has to integrate the domestic political sentiment of the country with the foreign policy that he's trying to make. And interestingly, he's the only one who has, well, I guess the vice president too, but those two are the only one who have both of those perspectives. And that meant that Obama, you can see him as a sort of proto-Trump in this way, which is a horrible thing to say about him, but I still think it's a little bit fair. He understood what Trump eventually tapped into. He saw it on the campaign trail. And frankly, I worked in the Obama administration, and he used to say this, that, he couldn't go to the American public and ask them for the types of commitments to Europe, to the types of commitments to a rich continent that was capable of defending itself, merely to provide some sort of abstract concept like global leadership or regional stability, which meant nothing to his voters. And he was a lot smarter than Trump, and he understood the role that the United States played in these regional conflicts, in the regional stability of the Middle East, of Europe, and of Asia. He understood that if you removed America from that equation, you would create a lot of instability that would eventually, not quickly, but eventually be a problem even for the United States. It would very quickly be a problem for other parts of the world. So he was looking for, and I think he was very explicit about this, certainly within the administration. He was looking for a glide path for reducing American commitments, particularly to Europe, but also to the Middle East. And that's a lot what the pivot to Asia was about. And he didn't get a lot of response from his own administration, certainly from the foreign policy community on it. And he to a degree, failed to untangle the United States from its foreign commitments. Certainly, he didn't succeed as much as he had hoped, because his own government was against him, and because he had an attachment. He had an intellectual attachment to the role that the United States was playing in foreign policy. So Trump is sort of the stupid version of that concept. He has the same political sense that Obama did about what the voters actually want, and a lot less responsibility about the world, and not anywhere near the sense of history that Obama had, and he's willing to be a lot more abrupt. But actually, one of the things you see, and it's been a little bit of a surprise to me, is the difficulty that he is having. It's a similar difficulty that Obama had in actually implementing that vision. I mean, his problem is slightly different than Obama's. It's that he has no idea how the American government works. He has no idea how to actually implement a policy. He doesn't really believe very much in the policies that he has. He doesn't care about them. They're on a mission for him. And so and he doesn't have anybody to hire. He doesn't have any people that he can put in who have both the experience in running the government and actually share this belief, because the foreign policy community doesn't share it. So a lot of the people that he's hired, even at very high levels of his administration, don't share his perspective on the world. And that's where the difficulty for me comes in. If you look at Trump's campaign record, rhetoric, if you look at his perspectives on Europe, I mean, it's incredibly clear. He basically thinks of Europe as the sort of poor relatives who come over to your house to borrow money and then stay all day and swim in your swimming pool. He thinks that they're free riders. He thinks that they are giving America a bad deal. You know, he is the only president to come out, only presidential candidate since the 1950s to come out against the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Pact, which is a 1951 treaty between the U.S. and Japan, which in my view has been a very, very successful treaty, because before we had the treaty we went to war with Japan, and since then we haven't at all. Trump points out correctly that treaty commits the United States to defend Japan and doesn't commit Japan to defend the United States. And people like me have said, well, who cares? There's no need for Japan to defend the United States. But in his view, that's a bad deal, and that's a concept that resonates with the American people. And even though the NATO treaty is a little bit more balanced than that, in practice, the same thing applies. We are, in U.S. politics, we're talking about taking in, Montenegro just joined NATO, for example. It's not that difficult to imagine that the United States, because of Montenegro's membership in NATO, may have to defend Montenegro. Certainly, we're already supporting their defense. In a sense, already paying in part for their defense. Montenegro is never going to defend the United States. It's never going to send troops. There's no point, and there's no need for it, but there's no concept of it either. And so I think Trump has been very clear in pointing this out, but he hasn't been able to operationalize this at all. And as a matter of fact, if you look at what has actually happened in his administration to U.S. support for Europe, it's actually gone up a little, not much. I mean, he's doubled down a little bit on the Obama support for what they call the European Reassurance Initiative, which is the sort of response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine by putting more money and more U.S. troops. It's not a lot, but it's something in Eastern Europe. Particularly in Poland and in the Baltic states. And that is completely at odds with what Trump not only said during the campaign, but what he said since he's been president. And it's happening because his Secretary of Defense and the people below that person want it to. They are part of this old foreign policy consensus, and Trump, as a governor, has no idea how to control them. So if you're asking me, to get back to your question, Ricardo, which was a fair one, although an impossible one, in the long term, I don't think that you can build an effective, consistent policy toward Europe on the basis of opposing the American people and the American president's preferences. But in the short term, that is precisely what they're doing. And I'm not so clear on how long the short term is. I think that the American commitment to Europe will continue to reduce. By the way, the United States has the fewest troops today abroad that it has had since they started taking those figures in 1957. So it is on a sort of a trend decline. But I don't know. I don't know the degree to which it will require a few more campaigns in a more talented president, a more talented governing president, to actually operationalize that.
Okay, many thanks, Jeremy. I hope that Jeremy, thanks to my super smart questions, has drawn a comprehensive picture of what Mr. Trump represents for Europe and what might, for the United States, for America, and what might end up meaning for Europe. Now, the floor is open to questions from you, so don't be shy, but be concise if you can. Over there.
And introduce yourself, too, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your contribution. My name is Giulia Giuliani. And my question is elaborating on the previous one, because it's about TTIP, because probably the agreement is not going to be ratified because of the growing opposition, especially in Europe, and because of the view of President Trump that EU is irrelevant. So, to what extent does it change, like, the relations between EU and US? So, how will they cooperate in the future, and what other with other countries will Trump interact? Because it cannot just live isolated. It would need to find another trade partner, because also China, it has problems with China. So where else will the relationship of America be directed? Like trade relationship.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I would collect a few questions and then get back to you, if there are over there. Yes.
Yeah. My question relates to the idea of.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm Sara Megattini, and my question deals with the fear for Hillary Clinton during the elections and the idea that America should not involve so much in the global arena. The question is that after seeing President Trump for a few months acting very abruptly on the international scene with his tweets and his way of saying things, do you think that the fear that the Americans had that Hillary Clinton would involve so much internationally would have had lesser consequences than Trump politics, Trump's way of saying things in the international arena? For example, like causing consequences that were not taken into consideration, but will involve America even greatly in the international scene, like military also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Over there, just one last question.
Okay.
Yes, I'm Gabriel Mere. I have two questions. I don't want to bore anyone, but I'm very curious. The first one is that Trump, in my opinion, was absolutely undervalued also by the Republican establishment, because Mark Rubio was the perfect candidate, but the first time in Iowa, I don't know, the caucus, won Ted Cruz, that in my opinion was worse also even than Trump. and also was undervalued by the Democratic Party. And I was in Rome, especially in the city center of Rome, where there are 3 American universities and 2 centers for American studies. So I interviewed, I don't know, maybe 3,000 of Americans, and no one said that vote for Trump. I know it's a low percentage, but
you might have had a biased sample.
No, yeah. And the president for the Center for American Studies said to me, "You are too young. You don't remember Ronald Reagan. He was an actor, but he is a Democrat, but he was, in my opinion, was a good president. I want to know, in your opinion, could Trump be the new Ronald Reagan, or he should suffer an impeachment after the election in 2018?
So you said you had 2 questions. Okay, the question about impeachment was the second one.
Yes, there was another one. I'm sorry, it was the third one.
Okay, so could Trump be another Ronald Reagan? Okay.
So trade, TTIP.
Yeah, so Julia's question on TTIP. I think, you're right that that the TTIP isn't going to be concluded. It actually died the day that Trump was elected. And Trump was very, very clear during the election, and frankly, as I said, his most consistent position in his political career has been on trade. As a matter of fact, trade is the issue that brought him into politics in the 1980s. It was opposition to what he saw as Japan stealing American jobs. And it was this sense that he's consistently espoused that America has bad trade deals. And that particularly he resents the idea of a multilateral trade deal. His point of view is that America is a huge country with a big market, with the biggest market in the world. And it should be able to leverage that market in individual trade deals to get better deals. I'm not quite clear on what these better deals actually are. But assumedly they mean a lot, in a very mercantilistic way, access for American exports while giving up relatively little access for imports to the United States. Because he has this sort of very strong sense that trade surplus good, trade deficit bad, which is, to be fair, common among politicians. And so he is very, very hostile to things like NAFTA and TTIP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which he thinks devalue the size of the American market by creating a multilateral trade deal in which the United States is less able to exercise leverage. But if you think about what that means, and again, to be fair to Trump, it doesn't mean that he's not interested in trade deals. It doesn't mean that he's not interested in trade. And by the way, the United States the EU as a whole is the United States' largest trading partner, and it hasn't needed TTIP for that, and that obviously can continue. But what Trump wants to do is negotiate individual trade deals with individual countries and to make those deals more favorable to U.S. exports. And this is why the UK Brexit issue is so near to his heart. Because by removing the Great Britain from the United States, it opens up Great Britain to the need to from the European Union, Freudian slip. It opens up the United Kingdom to an individual trade deal with the United States that can be very advantageous to the United States and can be a pattern. And of course, the UK desperately needs this. And Theresa May has held this out as a sort of indication that the United Kingdom can exist outside the EU very successfully. But of course, she hasn't seen what the deal looks like yet. She won't for a while. But in fact, my prediction would be that the deal will be very, very bad for the United Kingdom. It will be very, if Trump is still around to design it by the time the United Kingdom gets around to actually leaving the EU. But if that were to happen, I think the deal would look very, very bad for the United Kingdom. So Trump, frankly, the United States doesn't need any new free trade arrangements to exist. Trump isn't fully against them, but he has a very different concept of them, and he doesn't want them to be multilateral. I think that answers the question. Does that answer your question, Julia? Yeah. The question about whether Trump's actions in the first 6 months have changed opinions. I think you sort of asked me if it's changed my opinion. And, I was never afraid of Hillary Clinton. So I didn't need to have my opinion changed. And to me, Trump is a very dangerous person. I was always afraid of him, and I've become more afraid of him. But I think probably the broader aspect of your question is whether the actions of Trump as president have changed that dynamic, if I read you well. And whether people regret that, as when someone put it, recently when Trump was threatening North Korea with nuclear war because he was having a bad day, someone sort of tweeted out, well, thank God we didn't elect the woman who had abused her email server. And I think that does sort of get to the false equivalence that was created between the two during the presidential election. But intriguingly, there is very little evidence that this has changed people's opinions in the first several months, I think for several reasons. First, the American public, and I don't think I can emphasize this enough, does not care about foreign policy. They are very, very disinterested in foreign policy. They feel threatened by terrorism, but that's about the only foreign policy issue that really penetrates, unless you consider trade a foreign policy issue. But trade, immigration, terrorism, these are all sort of quasi-foreign policy issues. But the issues that you would talk about here, about regional conflicts, about Russia, about the European Union, there is a spectacular amount of indifference to those questions in the United States. They have no impact on the ordinary people's lives. And they are very unconcerned with what Trump is doing or not doing, broadly speaking, on the foreign policy issues. And this is part of what confused me, I think, during the campaign. And I remember it very specifically from an interview I saw with a Trump voter in Ohio. It was before the election, and they said to her, but it was obvious during the election that Trump has not been a surprise as president. It was obvious that he was a bit crazy and a bit dangerous. And they asked this person who had said they were voting for Trump, are you at all worried that Trump might, start some sort of crazy war and kill us all? And she said, oh, yeah, I'm definitely worried that he might kill us all. But things have to change. So I have no idea what that means. That is crazy, if you think about it. Yes, this guy might get us all killed, but I think we should run the experiment. But in fact, in the United States, which is a country which has been incredibly secure for 150 years, people don't really understand what instability looks like. They don't really understand what a foreign policy threat is. We have not had a foreign policy threat in the United States in the lifetime of anyone who's there. And so I think that, broadly speaking, they can't really conceive that you could do enough damage to America to actually create a true foreign policy threat. This is interesting because it's not, if you were trying to say that kind of thing in Poland or in a country, even Italy, I think, that has a lot more recent experience with actual foreign policy threats and actual wars that happen at home, I think you would get a very, very different response. But I think people are a lot more conservative with a lowercase c with their security. So it doesn't seem as if Trump's wild actions on the international stage, which I quite agree with you deserve that description, they've had a big impact on populations abroad, on leaders abroad. I don't think they've had much impact in American politics. And I don't think they will, absent a very, very conspicuous disaster which really deeply affects Americans at home. And that's actually going to be difficult to pull off. It's possible, but the very weird thing about being the American president in foreign policy is that you can do things wrong for a very long time. You can make a lot of mistakes, and it doesn't really have any impact at home because you have a huge cushion of security. On the last question about could Trump be another Reagan? I'm not sure what to do with that. No. Reagan, I don't think Reagan was a particularly good president. And he had, it's true, been a Democrat. But to be fair to Reagan, he definitely had an ideology. He definitely had a sense of mission and things that he wanted to accomplish. And he definitely had a sense, even though he wasn't much more knowledgeable than Trump, he was very reasonable about understanding what he didn't know, which is actually the only requirement that an American president really has to have. I mean, it's not important, and I say this with great sadness since I work in foreign policy, for someone who becomes the American president to know anything about foreign policy. Because you have hundreds and hundreds of people to do that for you, and you can get the smartest people in the world to do it for you. All you need is the ability to listen to them, and the ability, the sort of gut instinct, to judge between them when they disagree. And Reagan could do that. To do that it does require a judgment. But most of all, it requires a degree of humility and a degree of security in yourself. That you can sit in a room and there can be a bunch of people there talking about an issue that you don't know anything about, and you're okay with that. That's not as easy for most people as you might think, especially men. But I guess I always felt like if I was president of the United States and I'd been elected and I had my own plane and my own Secret Service detail, I wouldn't really mind if someone knew more about North Korea than me. And I'd be willing to listen to them. And Reagan certainly was. And Reagan was pretty good at judgment, pretty good at distinguishing between his advisors when they disagreed. Trump is not able to listen to his advisors. He lacks the security of his own. He lacks the sort of sense of self where he can sit in a room and not be the smartest person on every subject. That's super dangerous for a president, because nobody will stand up to the president in an argument, no matter how wrong he is. None of his advisors will. They all work for him. And so Trump is never going to get quality advice out of his advisors, and he's never going to be able to be even as effective a president as Reagan was. And I think it rests very deep in his psychology. It says something very terrible about a person, that despite having achieved all that Trump has achieved, having been elected to be the most powerful man in the world, their fundamental approach to the world is still one of insecurity, one of ego gratification. That's the most dangerous kind of person you can have as president.
Jeremy, Gabriele also asked about the impeachment issue, which is a quite complicated issue, both from a legal point of view, from a procedural point of view, and from a political point of view. But I know you have definitely the gift of synthesis. So why don't you try to explain to them how impeachment works and whether you think that impeachment can actually be valid, be conceivable in the case of Trump?
As a procedural issue, it's not super complicated. In fact, The Constitution just says that the president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. It doesn't define what they are. It's from a standpoint of the practice, it's been determined that Congress is fully empowered to determine what those are. And there is no legal, they don't have to be crimes in the legal code. They can be, but they don't have to be. And in fact, the president can be impeached by the Congress for anything that the Congress defines he should be impeached as by. It's not important that he have committed a crime. It tends to be that he's committed a crime. And then impeachment happens in two stages. Actually, it's a sort of weird linguistic thing that impeachment is not actually the removal of the president. Impeachment is the indictment of him for a crime, for one of these high crimes and misdemeanors by the U.S. House of Representatives. So president can be impeached by a simple majority vote of the House of Representatives, but that doesn't remove him from being president. He is then brought to trial because of that impeachment. He is brought to trial in front of the Senate. And it requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate to remove him. And if 2/3 of the Senate find him guilty of the crime that the House has accused him of, he is removed. That has never happened in American history. There have been 2 impeachments, and in both cases, one was of Andrew Johnson in the 1860s. He was impeached for refusing to obey a law that Congress had put into place that said that he had to ask them before he fired his cabinet members. A law that he viewed as unconstitutional, in fact, was later ruled unconstitutional. So it was a pure political act. The second, and he was found by 1 vote not guilty in the Senate, or he was acquitted in the Senate, and so not removed. The second is one you're probably more familiar with. It's Bill Clinton in 1998, and he was impeached for obstruction of justice, and he was also found. He was also acquitted in the Senate by a lot of votes. I can't remember how many, but I think it was. I don't even think they got a majority for that vote. Do you remember?
No, I don't remember.
In any case, he was acquitted. So ultimately, you need 50% of the House and 67 U.S. senators to impeach the president. It is, in my view, impossible that regardless of what emerges on, say, the Russia scandal, that the president will be impeached, certainly for things that come out of the Russia scandal. I will only put it this way. He could conceivably be impeached. I would doubt that. He will not be removed, as Bill Clinton was not removed. The reason for that, I think, is that impeachment, as we've seen in the Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton impeachments, impeachment is fundamentally a political act. The crime doesn't matter very much. And particularly in Donald Trump's case, if you want to impeach the president, you can always find a crime. And if you don't want to impeach the president, you can ignore any crime. And I would say they've already done pretty well at ignoring a lot of crimes. The president has been in violation of the emoluments clause of the Constitution, which says you can't take money from foreign governments while you're in office, since the day he entered office. And a lot of people have noted that, but the Congress is uninterested in it. Now, if there was a major political change in the United States, the Congress, because it's a political act, the Congress could conceivably turn on the president. But for that to happen, at least for the Republican parts of the Congress to turn on the president, he would have to lose control of the Republican base. As long as he has the support of the base of the Republican Party, they are going to be too scared to go against him to that degree. They are going to be scared that they will alienate their own electorate, and that they will lose not to the Democrats, but to Trumpian Republicans who will run against them in the next election.
So just Nixon resigned in order to not be impeached. So it could be. I remember that. So Richard Nixon. So it could be the same.
Yes, but he was actually going to be impeached. My point is that Donald Trump is not going to be impeached, so he doesn't need to resign. And he is not. There's no evidence that I can see that he's going to resign because he becomes tired of the job or anything like that. Richard Nixon, I think, is an important and interesting case, but the essence of it is that he lost the faith. He lost his connection with the Republicans, and the Democrats controlled Congress. Yeah. Now, the Democrats could conceivably control the House after the 2018 election. And then they could at least impeach the president. I doubt they would, frankly, because they would never succeed at removing him. They're not going to have, they're almost certainly not going to control the Senate after the 2018 election based on the sort of electoral map, which runs against the Democrats very heavily in 2018. And they will never have 67 votes in the Senate. So I think you would have to have, in order to impeach the president, he would have to have a lot lower popularity than he has today, or he would have to have a scandal which actually resonates with his base. The Russia scandal is clearly not it. The emoluments clause is clearly not it. And I don't. It's a little bit difficult for me to imagine one at this point.
Other questions? One over there. Then the woman over there and the gentleman here.
Good afternoon. My name is Enrico Biali. Thanks for your contribution. My question is concerning the relationship between Russia and the United States of America. Because during the electoral campaign, we have seen a deep contrast between the two candidates concerning the relationship with Russia. Clinton seemed frightened of the Russians, and at the same time, Donald Trump said during an interview that President Putin is a smart guy. Well, now we are in front of a critical moment between the relationship in the relationship between Russia and America, and sometimes I think, are we describing the presidency of President Donald Trump or President Donald Clinton? Because it's a sort of hybrid policy if we compare it to Trump's ideology during the electoral campaign. Which factors, in your opinion, has played a crucial role in order to describe this turning point? And are there many possibilities to see an improvement between their relationships or not?
Thank you. I think that Trump would really hate that, Donald Clinton. That would really.
I'm going to start to use that.
That's something he would really, really hate. He likes very much hearing his own name, and more Trump than Donald apparently.
Yeah. He would prefer Hillary Trump, if you don't mind.
the lady over there in the second row.
So thank you for your contribution. My name is Francesca Capoluongo. I found really interesting the points you underlined before about the probability that also the next candidate will not run with a globalist agenda. So I would like to ask, which impact would this change have on the future global configuration? So whether it will be a multipolar system or any other configuration. And would it really be so bad or so dangerous not to have the U.S. acting as war police any longer? Thank you.
I told you. Gentleman over there. Could you speak in the mic, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Federico. My question concerns more the internal policy of the U.S. And more precisely, I would like to know your opinion about the growing and striking differences between the presidency and Congress with regard to the use of war powers, and how this could reflect on the North Korean issue that we are seeing these days from a constitutional point of view. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not really sure what you're referring to.
About the use of war powers in accordance with the Constitution from the President or the Congress.
I haven't noticed a fight on that between the President and the Congress.
I mean, the striking differences between the use of war powers depending on the situation, I mean, because we know that Congress has to authorize every use of force according to the Constitution, but at the same time we have seen that during the entire history of the U.S., especially in the last century, President took very often the initiative in using force abroad. Thank you.
Okay, so a constitutional matter, Russia, of course, and would it really be so bad, a world without the United States as the center of gravity? This is, well, question number one in so many debates I've been taking part in, and I've never actually heard your opinion on that. So very, very good question.
Yeah, thanks. Why don't I take those questions in reverse order, since that's the order in which I remember them. The war powers question, you know, this isn't a very live issue in the United States, to be perfectly honest with you. There is the constitutional question does exist, and you can hear it debated among scholars and people like me, frankly, and I find it quite interesting. But there isn't much of an actual political fight between the Congress and the President on this question, and hasn't, frankly, been for many years. It's quite intriguing, really. You said it slightly wrong. The Constitution doesn't say that the Congress must authorize any use of force. It says that the Congress must declare war. And in fact, the United States hasn't declared war since 1941. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but it's been fighting quite a lot since then. And so the concept of the declaration of war has become completely irrelevant. And that has led over the decades, particularly in the 1970s, where this was a very live issue, for people to say, well, what the hell? How can you say you can send 500,000 people at one time to fight a non-war in Vietnam? You've completely gutted the meaning of the Constitution, even if you're not technically violating it. And there was a fight about this for a while, but by the Reagan administration, basically the Congress just gave up. And it's intriguing the degree to which it's reached. The Congress is a picture of irresponsibility on this question. It's not that they're arguing with the President over who gets to do this. It's that they're refusing to even weigh in. One of the reasons that Obama didn't want to go to war in Syria is that even though a lot of members of the Congress, probably the majority of the Congress, said they wanted him to, they refused to vote for it. They refused to take responsibility for it. And he basically said to his political advisors, why would I go to this war that I'm not really that sure about, but the Congress wants me to do, when they won't even vote for it? And he actually his administration made an effort in his second term to reauthorize, to get the Congress to define and authorize the whatever you would call it, the war on terror, the fact that the United States was fighting Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups abroad on the basis of a one-sentence authorization of war that was passed in the heat of the moment on September 12, 2011, which basically says, go abroad and kill Al Qaeda, get back to us when you're done. And sometime next year, the United States will send to war a soldier who, on the basis of an authorization that was made by the Congress before he was born, because it will have been 18 years. And the president was incredibly uncomfortable with that. President Obama was incredibly uncomfortable with that, and asked the Congress to define his authorities in the war on terror, or whatever you want to call it, more precisely. And they refused to take up the question. So as of now, there's been an abdication of responsibility. The president can do whatever he wants, and he's in fact so free. I don't really know about Trump on this question, but Obama's view was that he was so free that he wished Congress would impinge on his authorities a little bit more. On the question of what does U.S. withdrawal mean for the future global configuration, and would it be so bad if we weren't mucking about in the Middle East all the time? Look, I think that what we have to understand is that for better and for worse, the United States has become very integral to regional stability in Europe and Asia, in the Middle East. And withdrawing it would be, at the very least, risky. My personal view is that that it's going to be withdrawn. So the question of whether it will be so bad is not a super interesting one. The question is, are we going to be able to do that in a slow and evolutionary enough way to preserve the level of stability, at least the level of stability that we have, and hopefully enhance it? Are others going to step up, in other words? And it's interesting, in the Obama administration, they were always trying to sort of, I remember it specifically with regard to Ukraine, sort of trying to say, okay, look, we could do this thing, but if we do, you'll never really learn how. So why don't you do it? And Europeans, broadly speaking, were not interested in that, a little bit. Sometimes they claimed to be interested in it. But they were a little bit like teenagers. They were sort of like, they claimed to want danger, but when something bad actually happened, the first thing they did was call their parents. And I think I think ultimately the world could accommodate this. I think ultimately stability could be preserved. And that's an unusual perspective for someone in my position. And most of my colleagues at Brookings don't agree, and I have this fierce argument all the time. But I have to acknowledge that they have a point, that this is a very risky move. I probably wouldn't advocate this move if I didn't feel like it was just necessary, if that both American politics and American power meant that it's not sustainable for the United States to continue the role that it's had for the last 70 years because of trends in the United States itself. And so we have to adjust the regional balances to a decreased view of a decreased presence and role of the United States. What I worry about is that happens because nobody is actually willing to sort of move slowly in that direction, because nobody is willing to think about how to have a strategy to accomplish that in the most stable and evolutionary way possible, that it happens quite suddenly, that a figure like Trump, but one who actually knows how to run the American government, shows up and just abruptly withdraws the United States. And I do think that would be destabilizing in Europe, but even more so in the Middle East and in Asia. Should I do the Russia question?
Yeah, the Russia question.
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating question, and it gets at it's the best example of the phenomenon I noted earlier, which is that it's not at all clear that Trump has control of his own foreign policy. Trump was shockingly and strangely consistent on Russia during the campaign. when the Republican National Convention happened in the summer of 2016, the Republican Party puts together a platform, which basically is supposed to represent the position of the party on all of the big issues of the day. It's never been binding on the candidates. It's really a sort of rhetorical document. It's never been considered very important. And Trump, because he is not interested in policy, thought it was even less important than most of the typical candidates. The nominee can get basically anything he wants in that document, but Trump paid almost no attention to it. While they were drawing up that document during in the summer of 2016, two representatives from the Trump campaign showed up in the room, insisted that the plank on arming the Ukrainians should be removed from the platform, got it removed, walked out of the room, and then didn't participate in the rest of the platform. It was the only thing in the platform that they were interested in. And Trump, for all of his inconsistency, has never had a bad word to say about Russia from the beginning of his campaign to this day. He's never had a bad word to say about Vladimir Putin. He has never taken up the debate about, even when the U.S. was, the most recent example is when Russia expelled 750 workers, not all you Americans, but workers from the U.S. embassy complex in Moscow. He thanked Putin for saving him money. And he has just consistently said that the United States should have a better relationship with Russia, could have a better relationship with Russia. But you are certainly right to point out that, in fact, his policy doesn't actually look like that at all. And it's very clear that the president's perspective on Russia is not shared even by some of his closest advisors. It's not shared by his Secretary of Defense. It's not even shared by his Secretary of State, who has the Order of Lenin, has some medal from Putin. And it's certainly not shared by his national security advisor. His chief Russia advisor in the White House is someone who used to work with Ricardo and I at Brookings, and she certainly doesn't share his perspective. So he has, and one of the things that we've noticed about Trump is he has no idea and no real interest in actually doing the sort of nitty-gritty to actually implement a policy. So he doesn't know how to operationalize the fact that he wants to be friendlier with Russia. And so he hasn't. And as a matter of fact, the opposite has certainly happened. It's fascinating to watch Putin's reaction to this. Putin really hated Hillary Clinton. It was Putin's view that Hillary Clinton had tried to overthrow him in 2011, 2012 by attempting to rig the Russian election. This may even be true for all I know. But she certainly failed. And so he was very, very interested in returning the favor. He really wanted to disrupt her election. He wasn't that interested in electing Donald Trump, it doesn't seem. He was just the opponent. And he has, and this is actually in Fiona Hill's book, he has a very interesting perspective on the American president, which maybe is wiser than ours, which is that it doesn't matter that much. He formed this perspective from his experience with George W. Bush. He had a very, very good relationship with George W. Bush, especially at the beginning of George W. Bush's term, but actually throughout. They liked each other, they got along, they could communicate well. And George W. Bush made him a lot of promises. And in Putin's view, all of those promises were betrayed, especially on Iraq and on Kosovo and on Georgia. And Putin was extremely upset at what America had done to him in those years under George W. Bush. But even in the end, he didn't blame George W. Bush. He blamed America. And I guess this isn't too surprising in a guy who was educated in a communist system. He believes in superstructure. He believes in the deep state. And he believes that it doesn't matter that much what the President of the United States thinks about Russia. The defense contractors and the Congress and the lobbies or whoever will ensure that America is aggressive toward Russia, regardless of what the President of the United States thinks. So he is probably the least surprised person around that Trump hasn't actually been able to deliver. I think he was willing to sort of, and you saw this right after Trump's election, he was willing to sort of sit by and see what happened on the off chance that he was wrong. But nothing happened. I doubt he was surprised, and he's already sort of moved into the mode that, Donald Trump probably does like Russia. I could probably release pictures of Donald Trump being peed on by Russian prostitutes, but what would be the point? It doesn't matter whether the President of the United States supports a better relationship with Russia. There won't be a better relationship.
Other questions? Please, go on.
Just a quick one related to Russia. I'd like to know your view about Obama relation with Russia. He announced the reset policy, but actually, in my opinion, it didn't obtain so many results. Thank you.
So, Gabriele, if I'm correct, wants to ask another question. Anyone else? Yes, so if you, please, I will go first with those who haven't spoken yet.
Could we get the name of the person who just asked the last question? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it.
I'm Francesca Toninato, thank you.
Francesca. So the reset policy. Please.
Good evening. My name is Adriana Terzigni, and I was curious about, it seems like Trump's final goal is to isolate the rest of the world from the United States. For example, the wall, Mexico, and the Muslim ban, and DACA, and he supports white supremacists, and eventually would like to, he's not happy with how America and the European Union is involved with America, and lately, as you've mentioned, with Japan. So I was wondering if eventually he will succeed, if America will still be one of the main countries leading the world power and economics. Thank you.
And the gentleman just behind you.
My name is Riccardo Ronchetti, and I have a question about domestic politics. So in view of the Charlottesville fact, in your opinion, what was the impact of the racial question on the 2016 election?
The impact of
race.
Race.
Oh, race.
Race.
Sorry, I misunderstood that.
Thank you.
Please.
I'm Laura Ferrari, and I would like to ask, in your opinion, what is going to happen with the current crisis in the North Korea?
Yeah. North Korea. Anyone else?
With an easier question, please.
Please, be brief.
I'll be very quick. No, I just want to know, because I remember in 2009, Obama said in his first speech, I will close Guantanamo Bay. 2017, sorry. It's still open. Thank you.
What was the question?
How long will it be open? Yeah, so like forever. So we have the Guantanamo issue, North Korea race in America today. America's isolationism and Obama's reset policy, which is a bit weird to talk about here, but...
Well, it's a question, I think it's quite relevant. It's a question that I have firm views on. Because I was in the Obama administration, and part of that policy, it was the impression of the not just the impression, but the view of the Obama administration when it took office that the United States' relationship with Russia was needlessly bad. And when I say needlessly bad, I mean that they were fighting about things that they actually agreed on. It wasn't that they didn't have disagreements, but actually they had a lot of agreements. And they weren't even able to realize the things they agreed on. And the premise of the reset policy was never, and I want to really emphasize this, and was never to create a relationship with Russia like the one that the United States has with Germany or Italy. It was to make us fight only about the things that we differed on. In 2009, there were some really key things from the Obama administration's perspective that the United States did not differ with Russia on, that it was nonetheless unable to cooperate with because the atmospherics of the relationship were so bad. They were threefold, the principal ones. Reducing stockpiles of nuclear weapons, Afghanistan, and Iran. These were very important issues to the Obama administration, and Russia was the key to all of them. And on all of them, the reset policy succeeded in creating cooperation on all of them, which in fact was incredibly valuable to the United States and arguably to the world. Without the reset policy, there would be no Iran nuclear deal. Without the reset policy, the NATO troops in Afghanistan would have had a lot of difficulty getting supplied, and a lot of them would have been hungry during the upsets with Pakistan. And there would be several thousand more nuclear weapons in the world today without the Obama reset policy because of the START treaty that was concluded as a result of it. Obviously, it was never a panacea, and I think the atmospherics of the relationship got a lot worse particularly because of the Ukraine invasion more than anything else, but also because of the Russian perception, somewhat in 2011, 2012, the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, that the United States was interfering in its domestic politics and attempting to achieve regime change. I think we could have an interesting debate about who defected from the reset policy, whether it was the United States or Russia. My personal view actually is that despite President Obama, it actually was the United States. But I certainly, regardless of the answer to that question, would have the view that the reset policy was productive, very productive, in what it set out to do. But it obviously did not mean that the United States and Russia would have an easy relationship going forward, and no one, frankly, ever believed that they would. Look, you said it was Donald Trump's, your question. You said it was Donald Trump's.
To isolate the world from the United States.
Yeah,
The other way around.
to isolate the world from the United States.
It's a nicer ring to that.
Is that how you put it? To isolate the world from the United States, or to isolate the United States from the world?
It was Adriana, I think.
Adriana. Yeah.
You actually said.
It seems like he wants to keep apart some certain parts of the world, and eventually will isolate the United States by doing so.
Oh, yeah, I see what
creating
you're saying,
enemies
yeah.
a bit everywhere.
I think that there's if he was able to realize his vision, there's a real possibility of that. To be fair to him, he doesn't want to isolate the United States from the world. It is just a logical consequence of his policies. He is not ideological in that way, and I do think it's important to understand that he is not, from what I can tell, he is not somebody who is interested in cutting off the United States from the world. But he has such a puerile understanding of international relations that, in fact, I think you're right, it could be the result. And I am, frankly, quite worried. I mean, it's been a sort of theme in this discussion that what's protecting us from a lot of the worst consequences of Trump's policies is that he's unable to implement them. but he's not an idiot. And over time, particularly if he gets a second term, he will learn, I think. He will get people in place who will be able to help him. And he may well be able to at least create a greater isolation. It's going to be hard. And I think ultimately it's his undoing, because the United States doesn't want to be isolated from the world. It wants to be protected from the world like every other country, but also to be part of the world. That's a tricky balance to get, and I mean, I think this is common. This is true in Italy. It's true everywhere else, that people have this sort of weird, double relationship with the outside world. They want to travel to it. They want to be part of it. They want to benefit from it. They view themselves as open, but they're scared of it, and they're looking to their government to protect it. And finding that balance is, I think, difficult for any country. Trump, I don't think, is going to be very good at finding that balance. But if he manages to implement his agenda and overcompensates, he will create a backlash, because there is no sense in which the country wants to be isolated. It just wants to be protected. The question of race, it's really interesting. On one level, the race question has a really direct bearing on the outcome of the election. And it's very easy to see that in the breakdown of the voting statistics. But it's not maybe what you think it is. It's not that whites all voted for Trump and minorities all voted for Clinton, and that ended up electing Trump. That is sort of true. It's just that didn't change, really. There wasn't a dramatic change in the racial makeup of the vote between 2012 and 2016. The change was who showed up. And one of the things that we learned is that it is very difficult to turn out minority voters for white candidates. Apparently, at least for Hillary Clinton. And actually, if Hillary Clinton had turned out, in other words, if the same number of blacks had voted in Detroit in 2016 than voted in 2012, she would have won Michigan. She would have won all three of those states with the same majority, with the same minority voters. And these weren't people who switched their vote. These were people who stayed home. And so the decrease in black, especially black voters, but also, interestingly, Hispanic voters, was possibly the difference in the election. And it implies that the Democrats might be smart to run a minority candidate in 2016 and in 2020. I don't necessarily mean that they will. I think the question is probably a little bit more about, about racial divides in the U.S. and how those play into politics. I don't really feel qualified to answer that question, to be honest with you. I think they are super important. Obviously, it's on a certain level, it's the most important domestic issue. It's the way that domestic politics are shaped, and you can see that just by watching CNN on any given day. But I think it's not something which is in the process of a lot of flux, so I don't need it to explain particularly the difference between the 2012 and 2016 election. There is this very persistent sense in a lot of white America. I think it's something you see in Europe too, that their way of life is under threat from outside influences, which definitely have a racial component. They also have a sort of immigration component. Those two things are very wrapped up in each other. And that is really has been structuring the vote in the United States for quite some time. And it's why increasingly the Republican Party is becoming the party of white people, and the Democratic Party is becoming the party of minorities. And that's a trend, which you can see from year to year. It hasn't completed yet by any means, and there's still particularly quite a few white people who support the Democratic Party. I'm one of them. But you can definitely see that trend in American politics. It is, from a long-term perspective, incredibly dangerous for obvious reasons. And it is, the demographics of it are interesting because it would imply that the demographics of the thing would imply that the coalition of minorities is the future, because they're growing every year. Every 4-year cycle, there's approximately 1 to 2% more minorities in the voting pool, 1 to 2% less white people in the voting pool every 4 years. That's a fairly rapid demographic movement. Over time, that should overwhelm the voting system. But if, as you've no doubt noticed, the white, semi-majority is not going to go down without a fight, and they are actively trying to restructure the voting system to entrench minority rule, essentially. And you see this in the gerrymandering, you see this in the support for the Electoral College, you see this in the denial of voting rights for the District of Columbia. You see it actually in the voter registration, voter fraud fights that are being had. This is actually the central fight of American domestic politics right now, is who is the electorate going to be, and how are their votes going to be tallied, essentially. Right now, I think this is fascinating. We have a minority president, a president who was elected with a minority of the popular vote. The Senate was also elected with a minority. In other words, more people voted for Democrats for Senate than for Republicans, but there are more Republican senators because of the way the electoral system works. The House is the House in 2014 had more Democratic votes than Republican votes. In 2016, it had more Republican votes than Democratic votes, but not by very much, not as much as the majority that they have by seats. There's a very good chance that in 2018, the Republicans will continue to hold the Senate, the House, and the presidency, but they will have a minority of votes for all three of those. And that will be the American constitutional system. They are looking to be able to hold on to those elements of power with fewer and fewer votes. And the support that they're getting for that is very much along racial lines. Over the very long term, that's a form of apartheid. We're very far from that, I think, in the United States, but it's actually the direction that they're going. And I think it's not sustainable in a democracy, and it's a principal long-term threat to American stability.
North Korea, the easy question.
Oh, North Korea, I was trying to skip that one. I don't really know. The issue here, it's funny, for me, the issue itself is a relatively easy one. I feel as if, contradicting everything I said at the very beginning of this lecture, that if I were president, I could just easily solve this problem. And in fact, all you would have to do is just ignore it. I don't know about you, but I find that a lot of the problems in my life just go away if I ignore them. And that's not true of every problem, but interestingly, I think North Korea is a problem that it's intriguing that the United States even feels like it needs to solve. It wouldn't be threatened by North Korea if it wasn't threatening North Korea. So in order not to be threatened, it could just not threaten North Korea. But obviously, that's completely off the table. That is not the view of anybody that's not Trump's view, and it's not the view of the Democratic or Republican establishment. But it has been the view of the foreign policy establishment that North Korea is a problem that needs to be dealt with, but that it's not worth going to war over, and it doesn't make any sense to have a military option. Trump does not seem to understand that, and he is boxing himself into a corner on his threats, and so is the North Korean leader. They are astonishingly similar, in my view, right down to their questionable taste in haircuts. And I very much worry that they will end up in the sort of geopolitical equivalent of a macho pissing contest. I think they're already in that. And that could be extremely damaging to the world. I don't think that looks, interestingly, like a nuclear war exactly. It doesn't. It's not. This is again the sort of problem of being the United States. The United States can go to war with North Korea while doing itself very relatively little damage. It will do an extraordinary amount of damage to South Korea, and an extraordinary amount of damage to North Korea, and maybe even Japan. But not much to itself. And I think that creates some real risks that for an irresponsible guy like Trump. I'm not at all sure about this, though, because he has this sort of weird tendency to not follow through, to back down, he's dead set and determined to do something until the point that he just gives up. And so it's not inconceivable to me that he would just pretend that it never happened and move on. But it's also, if he always does that when he can find a way to pretend, at least to himself, that he hasn't been humiliated. And so the question is, I think the real question in maintaining stability there is finding a way not for Kim Jong-un to get out, but finding a way for Donald Trump to get out without feeling humiliated. And I am quite worried about that.
And finally,
Guantanamo, but I don't understand the question. What is the...
If there is any chance we're going to see Guantanamo closed one day?
Well, it's not the current administration's policy to close Guantanamo. I think that the Obama administration's failure to close Guantanamo tells you something about the sort of state of American domestic politics on terrorism. Basically, there are 40-something people left in Guantanamo, which is, down from 600 at the beginning of the Obama administration, but obviously it's not closed. And the question has always been what to do with those people. And the view, if you think about it, there's sort of three options, right? You can release them. You can, because, the best option would have been never to put them there, but that wasn't something that was open to the Obama administration. They were already there. You can release them. You can get somebody else to take them, or you can move them into the United States and try them. On a certain level, all three of those things were done. To some of the vast majority of them were released, were sent to other places, and other countries agreed to take them. A few, very few, I think like 12, were tried. Several were released, but that is extremely dangerous from a political standpoint, because if they end up committing some atrocity, you've released them. And so the ones who remain are people for whom they don't have enough evidence to try, or it's too secret, the evidence. They are too scared to release because they deeply believe they're dangerous, and if they do release them and they do something dangerous, they'll have huge political blowback in the United States, and they believe that that's definitely possible. or you can get somebody else to take them, and they can't find anybody to take the rest of the people that are there. That was the principal effort that the Obama administration was involved in. So nobody knows what to do with those people. And the Trump administration has no problem with it at all. So and as a matter of fact, they've said they're going to bring new people there, providing a bigger headache, I suppose, for the next Democratic administration. So I'm afraid I don't know how to close Guantanamo. If it were up to me, I guess I would just release them. But that is why I'm not President of the United States.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Before closing our discussion, let me ask you two final questions. You can answer really telegraphically. But looking ahead, we are not even a year into Trump's presidency, and it seems much longer, huh?
Yeah.
Does it? And
I've aged 5 years.
Yeah. So looking ahead, do you see any issue, domestic or international, on which Trump may actually surprise you positively? And this question number one. Question number two, which is very much related, is what is your most serious, credible fear, concern about what may happen in the United States or under Trump, or what Trump may do that end up really being damaging to the U.S. or to the U.S. standing? I mean, no distinction here between domestic and international issue. Your opinion about the one issue on which he can surprise you positively, and the one issue which you fear the most.
I mean, I think there's all sorts of possibilities for positive surprises from Trump, because there's just so many possibilities for surprises. I mean, I think he's incredibly inconsistent. He could do anything from one day to the next. He doesn't have firm views on most issues, and so if you think about that just randomly, he's likely to hit a couple of things I like. I think, if you look at his actual program, I mean, I think the policy that he has, which was one that was, I think, very important, and one that Hillary Clinton also had during the campaign, that I think is really important for the United States, and that actually Trump might have a somewhat better chance of implementing or getting through Congress than Hillary Clinton would have, is an infrastructure spending program. It's one of the few issues in which there's really a pretty strong bipartisan consensus, a pretty strong expert consensus. There's some definitely important disagreements about how it's financed and where it's spent. But frankly, any of the proposals out there would, in my view, would be better than not doing them. And I am a little bit hopeful that Trump will be able to get that through, and I think it would be good. I have to say, I think there's a pretty good possibility he will upside surprise me on any number of issues, but that won't really make me feel better about his presidency, because the essence of it is his volatility and his unpredictability and his narcissism. And that means that anything can happen for better and for worse, and that's not something I'm ever going to be comfortable with, even if there are occasional good days. So what is my greatest fear? I mean, I think the sky's the limit, but it's probably not in foreign policy. As I was, nuclear war is kind of a possibility, and I'm definitely against that. But when I look at the ways in which Trump is capable, without even really trying, of exacerbating the very serious domestic divides in the United States and continuing the type of polarization that I've been sort of referring to throughout, I think that is potentially his most baleful legacy. If he ends up creating a more polarized, especially a more racially polarized America, which I think is a real possibility, if he accentuates the very difficult racial trends, and he already has to a certain degree that I was discussing, I think that is my greatest fear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I hope you have enjoyed the discussion and that you come out of this room knowing a bit more about who the US president is, according to Jeremy, of course. And that will be all for today. Thank you very much.